Thank you for coming. Gee, this is a bigger turnout than I was expecting, because I know we've had popular history things that Greg and I did at McMiniman's, and we'd have 300 people show up, but that included beer and wine. And so I thought, well, the library doesn't have those amenities, so I'm not certain. But this is great to see this many people. And I've done, some of these slides are repeats, because some of the history is similar, but there's some new stuff. So that's the funny thing about history. You can keep adding new stuff. I've always started with the woolly mammoth because, well, I like him. And of course, they used to roam around here quite a bit, and I always like to complain about the fact that we don't have one. Why do we not? I don't know, because they have one in Tualatin, they have one in Sherwood, they have one in West Lynn. I know we should have one. Why has no one found one? But as many buildings as we dig around and put up, you'd think somebody would have run into some bones, but not yet, but we're still hopeful. I also like to, just what we're covering today, just so you kind of know, these are the major milestones. We're not going to cover them all, but we'll cover these front ones, which is the Low Bank Willamette, Boone's Ferry, the steamboats, the railroad, the freeway. You notice there's a theme here. Transportation is at the heart of a lot of what Wilsonville is and always has been. And then I'll kind of wrap up with Damaged Hospital. So this is all pre-incorporation. And then there's some other things we'll get to if you want to come, if you're not so bored that you want to come back another time. So those we'll save those for another day. And then I will do this really quickly because I know some people have seen it, but I like to remind people in terms of history. I won't do it again at the other times, but I'll do it once. And that is, almost all history starts kind of as folklore. Something happened and we chat about what happened. And then, and then it either gets recorded as history and documented as history, or it kind of turns into myth and mythology if there isn't enough to hold it together or enough agreement on what actually happened, then it becomes sort of a myth. But some of the important things that you have to ask yourself with regards to history is who's telling the story. And that is true for me also as a speaker, a person here. Are you getting your history from family members, from town leaders, developers, historians, authors? They all have their own prejudice, their own perspective, and it's you know, there's not one that is the accurate place to go. You have to ask yourself, what is the documentation? Because as any genealogist knows, there are no two sources that well, that's the wrong way to say it. There is no source that is infallible. Every one of these, including granite markers in the cemetery, you will find errors. You can find errors on all of these things because people put them down, they wrote them down, whatever. They're not perfect. And then the other thing is, are there conflicting accounts? Because a lot of those documents you'll find there are conflicting accounts. And I remind people when they say, well, but he was there and he wrote it down. But even siblings' recollections, who grew up in the same house, went to the same school, you know, had the same parents, they're going to remember the same events somewhat differently. And if you've watched the forensic files, you know that eyewitness accounts are, you know, kind of sketchy a lot of times. So And then the other question is what stories have been left out? Because most of our history in this part of the world, certainly the history we're talking about here, written down by white men who could read. So that eliminates a lot of people. So Native Americans didn't have a written language. The Chinese had a different language, so it didn't tend to get recorded with stuff here. Women weren't asked their opinion very often, and then everybody tends to leave out, or many of those sources I told you before, leave out the unsavory or the embarrassing, because especially in something like an obituary, you never see an obituary where they say he was a scoundrel and an SOB. He was always a prince of a guy, loved by all. And you leave out some of the other stuff, and that's true for the town, especially if it's written by the town mothers and fathers wrote it down. It was a wonderful town. We never had any problems. So, so those are the things that get left out. So now we'll get back to this, but I want to say that, put myself in that same category. And one other thing about it is history is always, the fun thing about history is that you are always discovering new things about it. It's kind of like scientific theory in that you come up with a theory, and then you test that theory. You see if there's documentation, or you look for the documentation, and it turns out you were wrong on this, that, or the other thing, and that's true in a lot of the things that I'll go into later. But I had a geography instructor in college who said geography is destiny, and except now I think he was wrong. Because I'm too uppity. I think it really is geology that is destiny. And certainly for us here and much of the Northwest. And you can't look at our history here without understanding the Missoula Floods, or the Brett's Floods, or the Ice Age floods, whatever you want to call them, that happened over the period of several thousand years. They didn't just all happen at 10,000 years ago. There were probably at least 60, as many as 90 different flood events where, let's see if this works, where I mean, you have to imagine, this is Glacial Lake Missoula. These are the Rocky Mountains, as we all know. They are very tall. They have very deep canyons behind them. There's a lot of water that they can hold on to here with this ice dam, which would alternately melt and refreeze, melt and refreeze. Not on an annual basis, but every couple hundred years, here it comes again. And when it broke, when that dam broke, then all this water came pouring through eastern Washington and down the Columbia, essentially a 400-foot wall of water. Picked up pretty much all the soil and in eastern Washington. They don't have much left. And then it came roaring down the Columbia, runs into the Coast Range here, where the Columbia runs into the Coast Range. So then it backs up into the Willamette Valley and the Tualatin Valley. And that red dot is Wilsonville-ish. To the 400-foot level. So we're at the 400-foot level. Our cemetery, Pleasant View Cemetery, is right about the 400, give or take, foot level. And you'll see there all of these glacial rocks. The big round boulders are laying all over the place. And that was pretty much how they discovered the floods in the first place. They're left like a bathtub ring around the whole Willamette Valley at 400-foot level. And so then, let me move forward here because I need to keep going. But let's look at our area up close. because this is from the Ice Age Floods Institute, their map. So you have to look at what else is going on here. Here's the Willamette River running up here, basically running from south to north. It runs into the Chehalem Mountains, so it takes a hard right and comes this way until it runs into the cliffs at Oregon City, the basalt cliffs from the volcanic Mount Hood. And then it turns and heads north again. This section is the Newberg Pool between where it hits the Chehalems here until after the falls. And so that's what's laying there. Now, the Tualatin Valley, when it was filled up at the 400-foot level, all of the Willamette Valley and the Tualatin Valley have to drain out. They have to, this massive wall of water has come in. It's got to slowly drain out and go to the Pacific. And there are two escape routes for the Tualatin Valley, one through Gaston here, the minor one, and one through what geologists call the Wilsonville Valley. And this one is the primary escape route. It can't get out the Tualatin because of the narrows at Westland. So it's kind of, this is leaking out, but this is pouring down through the scablands, the Tonkin scablands that are up here, which is why they're all scoured out, and why it's very flat across on both sides of the river. So this sets us up for all this transportation, because this is the only, in this Newberg Pool, in the east-west lay of the Willamette, this is the only low bank crossing where you can, both sides are low. Otherwise, you're going to run into the Chehalems, or you're going to run into the Westland cliffs or the falls. So that's what's set up. Now, Boone, of course, gets a lot of credit for his ferry. But there's no way that he just came along and discovered this flat place and thought this would be a good place for a ferry. Obviously, the Kalapuya, who were here for at least 10,000 years, had already discovered this and were already using it, and already had Indian trails going through here in this north-south, and they had canoes going across before Boone ever got here. And anyway, we'll talk about that later, but this is what set us up for all of our history going forward. Now, before Boone got here, we have to mention the Hudson Bay Company. They were, of course, here for beaver pelts, not pellets, but pelts. They were mostly French Canadian. It was a British company, but they're mostly French Canadian workers. They were not allowed to bring white women here, and when they were no longer employed, they were required to go back to Eastern Canada. Many of them took native wives and had lots of native children, or children who were half native. Hudson's Bay also hired Native Americans for their labor and other services, and certainly used a lot of their equipment, mostly these canoes. Now, I can't remember where I got this picture, but I'd been using it a while, and then it finally occurred to me, there's something wrong with this picture. Because they're portaging in the wrong direction. Those are beaver pelts. Why would they be carrying them upstream? They'd be going downstream to get them to where. So I don't know. So anyway, this is just a point of saying anytime you see a picture, whether it's a photograph or not, you have to question whether, how accurate is that, and would that have been the case? Hudson's Bay pulls out, is kind of slowing down. They've nearly extincted the beaver, and beaver hats are no longer in style. So by the end of the 1830s, they're pulling out. A lot of the natives, the people who had native families didn't want to return to Eastern Canada. They knew their wives and children wouldn't be accepted there, and they settled in French Prairie. So, so they were already settled before the pioneers headed this way. You know, quit the Hudson's Bay Company and didn't go home like they were supposed to. Here's Alfonso. He comes along in 46, but I have to say a couple of things about him. This is a picture of Alfonso. If you've looked at the one at the beaver board down in Oregon, at Boone's Ferry Park, it's not this guy that's on there. The picture down there says Alfonso, but it's actually his brother Albert Gallatin, who never got west of Denver. So, so wrong guy. Furthermore, he gets all the credit, generally speaking, for Boone's Ferry and Boone's Ferry Road, and I kind of think all the credit belongs to his son, Jesse. This guy is dead by 1850. So here's kind of the story of the Boones. They came on, of course, west on this trail. They were in a huge 1846 wagon train, and it split here. A lot of them came up on the Oregon Trail. Curry, George Law?
Yeah, George Law Curry.
George Law Curry
Right.
came this way, was part of that train. The Boones came this way on the trail to California, as did the Donner Party. So one of the things about this is it was this was the huge wagon train that the Donner Party was a part of. And so there's a lot of information on this particular train because so many people have researched the Donners. But anyway, at this point, the Boones decide to take this, which everyone knows is the Applegate Trail. It was the first year that the Applegate Trail was opened. It had been traversed by Applegate, but it had never been used by wagon and such. So the Boones were having to, you know, make their way on a trail that wasn't very well defined. And furthermore, everybody gets hit with probably what's happening this year, but they didn't know what to call it, an atmospheric river of snow, which came across early and hit the Sierra Nevadas and the Siskiyous, and the part of the party that the Donners were with, in fact, that Alfonso's sister was with the Boggs party, they got through Lake Tahoe here about 4 days ahead of the Donners before the thing hit. So they made it into the Bay Area on time. The Boones were stuck in the Siskiyous, abandoned most of their stuff in the Siskiyous, and then barely got into the Corvallis area where he had a relative. Christmas Day. Christmas Day they arrive in what's now Corvallis, but that's in 1846. So of course he doesn't get to Wilsonville in 1846. He doesn't start a ferry in 1846. And they went back in the spring of 1847 to get their stuff that they left in the Siskiyous, which by then had all been pilfered and wasn't there. So then they're going back up to the Willamette Valley. Anyway, this is, I guess I wrote this down. So here's how they're on there. They arrive in Corvallis. They don't get to Wilsonville until late summer of 47. And what do they need to do when they get to Wilsonville? Late summer. What, is there a house for them to move into? No. They've got to build shelter. So are they building a ferry? Probably not. They need food, they need fuel, they need shelter because they're getting in late in 47. In the spring of 48, what happens? Gold. Gold rush. And the three eldest sons head for California. So there's no one there to, Dad stays back with the 12-year-old son and the 10-year-old daughter, but Dad being Alfonso, but you know, so maybe he starts a ferry in 49, in 48, but in 49, his another one of his sons who didn't make the crossing with them arrives in Oregon, and he and the little one, the 13-year-old, both head for California too. He leaves the 10-year-old with the aunt in Corvallis. And then he dies in 1850 in California, Alfonso. So here's how you're trying to figure out when would Alfonso have started or operated a ferry. They had nobody to take care of it when he left in spring of 49. Anyway, late fall, the sons return. Only some of them stay in Southern Oregon. They never come back to Wilsonville. The only adult one who comes back is Jesse and the 13-year-old. Jesse marries Elizabeth in 1851. She's a friend of his older sister in Corvallis. And he starts the ferry. I mean, there's no question whether it was sort of started before or whatever. It's not till 1851 that he's here and ready to commit to this with his little brother who's now 13 or 14. In 53, Alfonso Jr., that's the little brother, he leaves because by then Jesse and his wife have a couple of babies and another one on the way, and it's a little cabin, and Alfonso, at 14 or so, leaves to hire on a steamboat, and eventually becomes a captain of his own boat. So, so he's one of those people. So for 20 years, Jesse is the one for sure who is operating that ferry, upgrading the power systems for the ferry. Moving from human power to horsepower to mule power and so on and so forth. In 72, he's shot and killed in a dispute over sheep by a neighbor, and there's that. This is I'll come back to that because his estate is important. Here's an early, I think, 07 picture of Boone's Ferry. And just to remind people kind of the condition, this is much later because you can see there's power or telegraph poles in the back. But this is the state of the roads in most of the Willamette Valley because there wasn't concrete, there wasn't asphalt, there wasn't even gravel. What were you going to do? It's just mud. So for a good 9 months of the year, it was virtually unpassable. They made some corduroy roads and things like that. But I think Jesse doesn't get anywhere near enough credit for Boone's Ferry Road. That was the massive engineering and construction thing, was building Boone's Ferry Road. We finally got him a marker, grave marker. He'd been in an unmarked grave in Butteville Cemetery for about 140 years. But, but we got that in a few years ago. I don't know, two years ago, 3 years ago. So I know you can't read this, but you don't have to. This is the other thing, is Jesse had, this is Jesse's land claim on the south side. This is the Willamette. This is his land claim on the south side of the Willamette. He also purchased the Thomas Bailey land claim, which is right here, and that's Old Town. As you can see in 55, it's the lots on the river that are going because they can't move otherwise. They need boats. They need boats to travel up and down the Willamette. Anyway, when he dies, when Jesse dies, he has debts and whatnot. And I guess I'm a little early. So, so what happens is his estate needs to be settled. He dies in March of '72, and in December they're auctioning off his land. He's left with he leaves a wife and mostly young children. It's auctioned off, and who shows up to purchase it but this guy? He wins the auction for the Thomas Bailey piece, which is Old Town, $550 in gold coin. That he purchases about 450 acres, which is pretty much all of Old Town. This guy, we don't, you know, I'm scrambling to find information on the guy. And here we're named after him, for goodness sake. There is not a picture to be found. And I talked to several people who've researched this guy and can't find a picture. As you can see, he dies in 1905. They had cameras, really. Leaves a bunch of children, and still nobody took his picture. What's that? He was German, spoke German, and so I say he was a man on the move, because in 1871, this is before Jesse is killed, he's here. Well, wait a second. I should probably tell you a couple other things about him, which since I just found out this afternoon, I don't have them right on the tip of my tongue. But he marries his first wife in Iowa. He marries a second wife in Chicago without really divorcing the first wife. And she divorces him a few years later. And he's living in Minnesota in 1860. By 1871, he is here doing land speculation. I don't know where he gets his money, but he's land speculating. He buys portions of the Minkler piece, portions of the Franklin piece, portions of the Bakers. He's bought a bunch of those before he zeroes in on this after Jesse dies. And then he gets this piece, which is Old Town, in 72, end of 72. And so here's kind of Old Town. He ends up with this number 1 in here is where his store is. He opens a General Mercantile a couple years later. And he becomes the postmaster, not right away, but he becomes the postmaster in 1876 and announces his plans to plat out a town. And then in June of 1880, I'll tell you why these dates matter or don't matter, he changes the postal name from Boone's Landing to Wilsonville. because he's now the postmaster. Yes, you get to do these things in 1880. But in the 1880 census, he isn't even living in Wilsonville. He's living on one of his Pleasant Hill properties up there. And he sells the store in 1883 and moves to Sherwood, where he lives until he dies in 05. So he's only in Wilsonville for not quite 10 years. He's not very established here. This is why I said he's a man on the move, and that's about all I know about Charles Wilson. But it's no wonder we don't have much about him, because he wasn't here very long. Anyway, on to the transportation things. Like I said, the roads were not functional. This is how people got around. This was the superhighway, the Willamette. It's why people came, why that first wave, those weren't farmers, those were rivermen trying to get those stakes on the Willamette so that they could start a ferry service, start a steamboat service. These steamboats were on the upper Willamette, were built in Kanema, which was the little town above the falls next to Oregon City. They were low draft boats for the upper Willamette. And now this is the first I've noticed this house floating by here. What's with that?
Must have been high water. There's a ski jump.
What's the deal there? Because these guys look like they're just out for a picture. But anyway, they went as far upriver as Corrales with these low draft boats. But this is how you moved goods, how you moved people, mail, everything went by the river. Some of the Wilsonville names of people who became captains. These were people who piloted the boats, not, and who knows how many more worked on them. It was every boy's desire to go work on the boats rather than stand behind a horse-drawn plow for months of the year. You know, farming was this was romantic and adventurous to get a job on a boat. They did eat a lot of fuel, steam things. You can see they would have to stop and cut down trees just to keep those boilers moving, burning. But a lot of these are road names you'd recognize from around here or otherwise old names. The locks came along in 1873. So this is the locks right here. Here are the falls, the other side. Of course, it put Kanema out of business. They were a shipbuilding center for the upper Willamette, and now they weren't. You didn't need those boats built up there. You could build them down in Portland or Milwaukee or anywhere and take them up the locks. So, so that was the end of the Kanema operation. Here's an aerial picture of the locks in 1932, and you see what all those things are. Log rafts, and all of these and these. Well, the locks are right here. See how skinny those locks are? These will not fit through it. So they had to be dismantled up here so that they could fit through the locks and then hog-tied up, put together in these larger rafts. And they're either waiting here for their turn in the mill or they're waiting to go downriver anywhere from here to Astoria. They were moving these logs out of the Willamette Valley. This is an interesting picture because now we've got the collision of two transportation things. Because here comes the railroad, and wait a second, I didn't mean to. I hit the wrong button. My wrong button. Up here is the trestle, the first wooden trestle. This picture I found in the library, and it says that this is, I think it's the MODOK, whatever it is, at Boone's Ferry Landing. But here again, you have to ask yourself, does that look right? Because if you haven't been down to Boone's Ferry Landing, I would recommend that you walk down to Boone's Ferry Landing and see that when you're at Boone's Ferry Landing, the trestle is like right here. Yeah. It's right next to the landing. It's not off in the distance. And one thing that you don't move easily is a railroad. So where it was, it always was. I think this is at a place called Miner's Landing, which is which I found on an old map, and it's in the Daydream area. So that makes more sense for this perspective. Here's a picture of the construction crew building the wooden trestle. So here's the Wilsonville train station. Long since disappeared, was torn down, but at its height, it was running 19 trains a day through this station. And it was not only the way that anyone got to Portland, it was also how kids went to high school, because before West Lynn High School was built in 1922, before that, everybody went to Lincoln High School in Portland at the time when it was located near Portland State. And they either went for every day back and forth on the train, or went in on Monday and stayed with friends and came back home on Friday. Or if they didn't have the means to do either of those things, some kids who wanted to go on to further education beyond 8th grade stayed at the Wilsonville grade school. You can see these are probably all high schoolers over here. This one is the teacher, but the others are high schoolers who are, and here are the grade schoolers. And the high schoolers could go there for free, I'm presuming, and also be helpful to the teacher in taking care of the younger students or instructing the younger students. So this is a series of school shows. This is a little bit of a detour from the transportation that we were on, but I show this to grade schoolers that this is the old school. This is close to when it was going to be torn down, and up there are the young trees that were all around that school, just off of Boone's Ferry. Here's the new school they built. This is a 2-room school built in 1912, and there's those same trees in the background because the other school is gone. And this is 2 classrooms and 2 teachers. Then it was replaced by this 4-room school, happens to be the school that I attended. It grew, here's those same trees in the background, and it grew to be, after 4 classrooms, to be 8 classrooms. And when it closed in 2000, it was probably 15 classrooms. But there was the old school, and here were those same old trees. And so then I'm playing for them this, because this is before the school was torn down. There it is in the back. Here's those same old trees now in front of one of the versions of Lowry's Shopping Center, and a later version of Lowry's Shopping Center. And there's those same old trees, which are still there. So you can go look at those trees now, and there's a monument out there that looks like this, and it has a picture of of that second school. The 2-room school is there, but all those schools took place or were built and gone next to those trees, which remain. And so now we'll go back to we'll resume where we were with the railroads. now that we took a detour for the schools. And then there's the trestle, wooden trestle burning down.
Were those electric trains? Because the last picture showed it was like Oregon Electric.
Yeah, yeah, this was the Oregon Electric on this one. The diesel, was it diesel or steam that was running the one on through Canby?
That was steam originally, but then went to diesel. But they had power stations to power these things.
Yeah. No, but this was the Oregon Electric coming through Wilsonville. Anyway, this is the problem with wooden trestles. They're pretty much built to burn. And then in 40, they built the new trestle, oddly enough, out of concrete and steel. And it's still standing. Moving on, here's Interstate 5 comes along to put the railroads out of business. So each one just kind of pushes the last one aside. This was the original concept for the Boone Bridge. It was a suspension bridge. They decided that was too expensive or something, and we have the one we have. I think it's called a steel girder or something like that. A double span. Anyway, that was then. Here it is under construction, and if you, this is looking north. Here's 5th Street, which used to come through and then go into Daydream. So this is where Daydream Ranch is. This is where the Hilton is sitting on this little hill. Here's Old Town over here. And there are some good copies of this picture in which you can see a lot of detail here, more than you can in this blown up like this. But it's a good picture of construction. This is the ferry right before it closed. It closed within days of the opening of the Boone Bridge. And that was the end of Boone's Ferry. As you can see, we're on the Butteville side, Butteville Road side, looking across to Wilsonville. Here's the Toffman House, old Toffman barn, but it's gone. And here's the road up. If it was just a little bit further over, you'd see the trestle sitting here. But that was the end of the ferry, which was the reason people came to Old Town, for crying out loud. And you know, you often had cars waiting to get on because it only holds a few cars. And so there were reason to stop and whatever. So the question is, was I-5 a boom or bust for Wilsonville? And you'll see things that say that discuss it in both perspectives. That it was some of the history accounts say, well, then when I-5 came, we started getting Tektronix and this and this and this. But that was in the 70s. There was a big bust period because Old Town just instantly died. And almost immediately, town boosters and others started trying to parcel together land parcel, put together land parcels to make a bid to the state of Oregon for locating the new mental hospital, state mental hospital. And they did the land deal with the state, I think in 55 or 56. Construction started in 58. Remember, the I-5 came in 54, so this is about as fast as you could move. And then in 61, Damish opened. January of 61, because it was supposed to open in 60, but it was late. Damish was probably the biggest development, biggest impact, single impact development in Wilsonville's history. for many reasons. We were still unincorporated, so so there was no municipal water, there was no municipal sewer, there was no municipal anything because there was no municipality. But so Damisch was pretty much its own thing. They had their own sewage treatment plant. They had their own water, big water wells. Probably some of you remember the towers. And and they had a steam plant with tunnels that heated the building with steam. It was its own city. And in fact, you know, here they are arriving in a town of 800 people, 800-ish, and they have 400 employees. So that's a huge impact. And a lot of those employees lived on the grounds. There were houses for the upper staff. There were apartments and dormitories for other staff. So it was a huge impact for businesses in Wilsonville, for the schools in Wilsonville, and just the whole social milieu. I mean, one thing about having a facility like this suddenly come in with that many employees, they're almost all college educated. In a town where, if you look at the 1940 census where it lists education level, there's hardly anybody with a high school diploma, even. It's mostly, it's a farming town. They're mostly 8th grade or something like that. So, so it shifted the social structure and educational expectations of the town. Oh, and I didn't point this out, but you can, if you didn't notice, this is the tree no longer there at the corner of Graham's Ferry and Tews. So this is Graham's Ferry running here, and this is Tews running kind of along there. But that's the intersection, which now has a light at Tews and Graham's Ferry. And there's the hospital. We still have this woods there, not any of those other things. But next time around, we'll talk about incorporation at last, how we finally get incorporated, because a lot of our neighbors, Tualatin and Sherwood, etc., incorporated in the 1800s, and we're sitting on our hands until almost 1970. And then, of course, the closure of Damisch, what that meant, and set off the prison siting battle, development of Villebois, and siting of Coffee Creek Corrections. That's what we'll do on the next time around. And with that, I will ask if there are any questions. And then I have and then I have one last slide. But yes.
I've always wanted to know about it because there's Graham's Ferry. I'm assuming there was a ferry involved with Graham's Ferry. Where was it?
Well, Graham's Ferry Road, if you take Graham's Ferry Road, it meets up with Wilsonville Road.
Right. And
it was kind of coterminous with Wilsonville Road for a little bit and then headed down to the river. It was coterminous for less than 1/10 of a mile down John Wallace Graham's property and over the bank there. So yeah, that's, I don't know how better without a map to describe it.
Closer to Champoeg then.
No, it's kind of halfway to Butteville. Yeah. Halfway to Butteville, because Butteville, they also had a ferry. That was the Ladd Hill Ferry that went from Butteville to Ladd Hill Road and on up Ladd Hill. So there were ferries like all over the place, and even more frequently landings for the steamboats, because they were giving mail and they needed wood. They were always hungry for it. There's a question here.
Yes, Charlotte, can you, I know your family got here very early. Can you just tell us a little bit about your family? There's a lot of aspects to that, but I think you told me before, some of your family got here about 1850 or really?
Yeah, 1850 is my earliest relatives. Those were the Zumwalts, and one of the Zumwalt girls married John Wallace Graham, and that where the ferry went down, that was part of Zumwalt's land claim initially, and he gave part of it to his son-in-law, really his daughter, and so that's one of them. So John Wallace Graham is also a grandfather of mine, and then the Grahams had the Youngs. So the main driver on the land deal, I didn't want to mention, was on the land deal for Damish was my grandfather, D.S. Young or Doris Young, who also was, he had, when I said we didn't have any municipal water service, he did have he created the Wilsonville Electric Company and the Wilsonville Water Company. And he was providing water and electricity off of a creek, off of Coffee Creek, and for about 250 homes, mostly in Old Town, close in. Anyway, so that was, and then he was the one who was really pushing to get Damish here. But it was a community effort because he didn't have enough land. They needed 500 acres. So he was putting together land deals with the neighbors. Wouldn't you like to sell part of the farm? Yeah. So I don't know what else to say on that. I often say, however, that people ask me, I say I'm the daughter of a farmer, and they'll say, well, I didn't know your dad was a farmer. I thought he was a teacher. And I said, no, my mother was a farmer. But people assume if you're a farmer, you're a man. But she was a farmer, and her father was a farmer, and so on and so forth up there. But there's the farm connection.
Can you tell a little bit about where the name Beckman shows up on roads and creeks all through Wilsonville? Where did they come from? And
well,
Charlotte, do you mind repeating the question since the mic?
Yeah. He's asking about Beckman. If we have time, I can show you Beckman, but I think, is it on here? Let me see. If I did this part and I left it out of this because I didn't know we'd have time. We've got Charbonneau, we've got Villebois, those are French. So you have to ask, how French are we? I tried to find all the French names I could, and these are the only French names I could find, all of which are relatively recent married names, where they married some German girl. Like, this is a Sealy, but Marge Montag, that's the park in Villebois. Let's take a look at the German names. I mean, yeah, they just go on and on. This is a German town. The French already had the land on the south side of the river. This is including Wilson, as I said. So, and Beckman is right up there. And of course, they started the German evangelical or something church, which is now the Frog Pond Church. But that was on the maps. It usually said the German church. So yeah, we were extremely German, and the Beckmans. Well, here's how you know. This is Charles Wilson's son, died at the age of 2. He's buried up in Pleasant View Cemetery. Well, look at the language. It's written in German. This is, yeah. And here's another one in my cemetery. It's in German. But this is son of Charles und Friederike Wilson. This is, any Germans here? Yeah, yeah. These are abbreviations for born and died in German. Gestorben is this one, and I can't remember what that one is. Anyway, same over here. I mean, they're all over the place. These are here's the Beckmans. This is up at Meridian Cemetery on 65th. German immigrant family settled here. And a number of them, and some of them you don't recognize right off the bat. This is Peters, but here's the German thing. That one's in German. And this is another thing that could be interesting to research. Why are they from Hanover? This is the Elligsons. This is another name I don't know, Papenburg, but they're from Hanover. And in my cemetery, I've got this guy, Henry Shute, and he's also from Hanover. So these don't appear to be related to each other, but they're all coming from the same town in Germany, so why? And here's the stone carver, clearly another German. At the bottom of the thing. Oh, here's the map. I took this off of the German church at the corner of Beckman Road and Wilsonville. So, so anyway, I wasn't going to show that. But since you asked, I had the Beckmans there.
What was the difference between the yellow names and the white names on the chart that you had up there?
There's streets.
Oh yeah, I think it was streets. The ones that were streets and the ones that are just here. And I was just talking with Sparkle Anderson. You know, we have an opportunity with Frog Pond. We've kind of missed it with Frog Pond West, but Frog Pond East and South, we've got a lot of streets to name. And maybe you don't want to name them a German word that nobody could pronounce, but there's a lot of them that you could. Peter's one of them. So if there are names, we should be thinking of names that would apply over there. I'm a West Sider, so I don't know the East Side as well, the families on the East Side, but I'd like to be able to give the planning department a list of names that they could work into the street names that would have some history, because we're really not French. Villebois has all these French names. That's cute, but that was a marketing thing, you see. And it's partly because the Germans, you know, after World War II, it wasn't very popular. So, like my cemetery, I got lots of Adolfs, but no more. Nobody gets that name anymore. So, yeah, there you go. Yes?
How do the Wilsonville Boones fit in with Daniel Boone in relationship?
Alfonso is his grandson. So Jesse is his great-grandson. And the Zumwalds and the Boones were related, intermarried, and had moved, as were the Bakers, who have Baker Road and a lot of the hill up there. They had immigrated from Pennsylvania to Kentucky to Missouri to Oregon in different generations, you know, but kind of together. So some of the Zumwalts would go, then the Boones would go, or the Boones would go and the Zumwalts would follow. And, you know, it was, but they ended up a lot in the same places. And with something like Ancestry now and so many people doing genealogy, you can put together a lot more of these threads than you used to be able to. But there again, there's a lot of errors on Ancestry, as any of you know, because people will put something down and then it gets copied onto, you know, 300 other charts. And it looks like it must be true, but if you haven't really tied down the documentation or the, you know, what causes you to think that's what happened, it can be pretty speculative.
So you mentioned that a lot of the Hudson Bay men marry native wives.
Right.
So earlier to this, was it like the Native Americans saying, "Come on down, boys, we're happy to have you here"? Or do I remember that in the cemetery, there are veterans of Indian wars?
There are. We have a number of veterans of the Indian wars, but there weren't any here. They're the Southern Oregon, what do you call the rogue?
Modoc. And they
Modoc
happened later.
They were later.
Yeah, were later than when the Métis, when the French Canadians would marry. Yeah.
Because I think that Hudson Bay was not as threatening to Native Americans because they weren't staying. They were required to leave. They were just trapping and going. They weren't settling on land, and so they were hiring natives who were helping them do these things because they were leaving. But and I don't know how they paid them with goods of some sort, but the settlers were a lot more threatening because they were wanting to stay. They were settling and taking over land, so which Hudson Bay was never doing. So and by the time the French, this is me speculating, by the time the French Canadians were decided to stay in French Prairie, they were all intermarried. So they had half Indian children and Indian wives, and so they're not likely to be have Indians be hostile to them staying, because a lot of them are Indian.
I was thinking early on.
But that's me speculating why that was never a problem in French Prairie. I should ask Ben. Ben Williams is the expert on French Prairie, but yes.
Well, when the Germans came, so that's French Prairie, when this huge German movement came, was there any conflict with the natives that lived here, or was it just they kind of?
Not really. There's they were later, and you know, I really don't know. I don't know. The Kalapuya were you know, went to the Grand Ronde to work.
So the treaties happened in the mid-1850s, and you know, so that's when that was settled. So there really weren't Indian wars with the Kalapuyans or the local Indians here. However, there were Indian wars with the Rogues, the Cayuse War is famous, and other things. So different part of the state and somewhat at a different time. So.
And people here did occasionally join up and go down to the Rogue Valley to fight in those Indian wars. I don't know what motivated them to do that, if the pay was great or what, but it would seem like if you were a farmer here, you'd be pretty busy. And then my last thing, this is one of those things that intrigues me. I have not researched this, but it is worthy of research. It should be a book, I think so. The difference between these towns. They were clearly, the river towns were the first timeline. Wilsonville, Butteville, Kanema, Dayton. The railroad towns were later. The river towns were very Wild West, not very organized. They had a lot of liquor. They had, Wilsonville had a couple of saloons, and with hardly any people living here, 100 people living here, we had a couple of saloons and a couple of hotels. Why? I don't think those were real hotels. But we're a river stop, and all those steamboats are stopping here. And Butteville, which was a much bigger town much sooner than Wilsonville, even more wild and a wild town. The railroad towns, Tualatin and Sherwood Canby, very organized from the get-go and incorporated early. Butteville never incorporated, Wilsonville not till just recently. But Tualatin and Sherwood Canby, they were all incorporated in the 1880s. They were neatly laid out into these nice little downtown things. And then you have the religious towns that were part of a religious group, Newburgh, Aurora, and New Era. Anyway, I think this is worthy of contrast and compare for how their history started and how it moved through time. And of course, one of the big ones here is Wilsonville was secondary to Butteville in time and everything else, size. But in the end, Butteville was left behind because they had neither a railroad or a bridge and a freeway. And so Wilsonville was able to move from one transportation phase to the next and the next. And Butteville is stuck in time. It's kind of stuck back there. But I haven't researched these other ones. I haven't done that. But I think it would be more interesting to kind of do that than your average history of Dayton little book that just tells the story of Dayton almost like an obituary. It was a wonderful town. So anyway, if anybody wants to take this on as a project, I'd be happy to help. Yeah.
You mentioned a town named Panema.
Right.
I'm not from here originally, but Panema is a name of a person, town, a Native American name?
I don't know where the name came from. Do you know it? It sounds Native American.
There's a Panema, which is on a reservation in Minnesota. And so
this is with a C, Kanema.
Oh, Kanema. Okay, this is a P. Okay.
Oh, okay. But it does sound kind of Native American, but then Tualatin is also a Native American word. And they're tricky because a lot of them were Native American word first written down by the French Canadians, and then pronounced by the English. So what did it sound like originally? No one knows. But yeah, Kanema is a little town north of, upriver of Oregon City.
Yeah, I've never heard of it. But it doesn't exist anymore.
Well, it's a little neighborhood.
It's a neighborhood.
In Oregon City. It's been swallowed by Oregon City.
They built the Sturm-Wheelers.
Yeah.
Kanema is a Chinook name for Canoe Beach.
Okay.
Now that makes sense.
Do you want to repeat that, Charlotte?
Kanema, he looked it up. It's a Chinook name for what beach? Canoe Beach. I guess.
Land your plateau there.
Yeah.
Around the ball.
And the other interesting thing about Kanema it's the first railroad in Oregon was between Kanema and Oregon City. It was about a quarter-mile long. But that was the portage because you had to offload everything and get it down or load it going up, whatever. it was a portage railroad, but it's the first railroad in Oregon.
I'm curious about Canby being a railroad town, but yet I think we still have a Canby ferry, right?
Yeah, it's funny because it was, you'd think because it's on the Willamette. The main thing they ever used the Willamette for, though, was for the log dump, because one of those early railroads was a railroad out of Molalla bringing lumber down. And it was coming down to that log dump into the river at Canby. But Canby, the town, was definitely built around the railroad.
I did a whole speech on this. Canby's named after General Canby, who was the kind of the head of this division during the Indian Wars. So he went through Canby twice, once on the way to the Modoc Indian War, and then his casket came back from the Modoc Indian War. He was killed, of course, there by Captain Jack. So essentially it was named by the town developer as an homage to the Union kind of general who was then in charge of the military in the Pacific Northwest.
But what's the name of the town father who platted it and everything?
Baker.
Maybe.
Yeah, I believe it's the Bakers. Yeah.
Okay. Anyway, that was definitely a whole corporate deal connected to the railroad, and there isn't really a connection to the river in Canby, other than that old log dump, which is now a park.
A lot of good stories
Yeah.
all these towns.
Has there ever been a movement or groundswell to change the name back to Boone's Landing?
People bring that up from time to time, but you know, sometimes names just take on they take on their own life, regardless of where they came from or whether they were a good name in the first place. It's got too much, Wilsonville now has too much history behind it of its own that doesn't have really much of anything to do with Charles Wilson, who was only here for about 20 minutes. So,
Probably the stationers and the sign makers would love to change that.
Yeah. I mean, can you even imagine? Because everybody's address would suddenly be wrong. But if there's nothing, was that?
I just wanted to ask, does Wilsonville have any kind of like city movement to try to preserve the historical buildings? Like, in Menemans, thank goodness they bought the old church.
Yeah.
But then that little one-room schoolhouse was torn down before I could blink. And I didn't know it was going to be torn down. I might have tried to do.
Are you talking about Corlawn?
The one that used to be right beside Wilsonville Primary. The little one-room
old
white
library.
Oh, yeah. That wasn't really it.
Okay. But I mean, like, there are some, like the old Frog Pond Church. Is there any movement to try to preserve some of those old buildings?
Yeah. Well, I think they're trying to preserve the Frog Pond Church for sure, and for sure the Frog Pond Grange building on Stafford. So they're planning the development around that as a community gathering place of some sort. But I was saying, I think we have not done a good job of preserving our old buildings, and I did at least get them to agree that they have to take pictures of everything before they issue a demolition permit. I don't care if it's an old pig building. We need pictures of things before they are wiped away, and you know, like the house that was out in the middle of Ellickson's Field there, south of Costco. Did you go take pictures? No, I did. I know I did. I took pictures of everything, inside, outside, the trim, the basement, the foundation, everything of that house before it came down. So there was no saving that. It was absolutely, had no foundation.
I would like to elaborate on your point, though, because it was announced at, I think, the most recent city council meeting by our building official that he has changed their procedures
Yes.
At your sort of behest, I suppose,
Right.
to require that demolition permits include at least a half a dozen representative high-resolution photos
Right.
to help preserve the history.
Right, so that we at least know what they were before they're gone. But we could do a better job of preserving some of the old buildings. The other one I worry about is the feed store. But what I knew as the feed store. It's on 5th Street. Paul lives there. Paul Mitzel's, yeah, art studio. But it's falling apart. It needs help. It's been moved before. It probably should be moved again, at least a few feet. It needs to be lifted and its foundation rebuilt and maybe moved a couple feet this way or that way. But I was hoping that might happen as a part of the 5th Street rebuild because we could have kind of put that into the project budget. But that didn't happen, so I don't know what the status of that's going to be.
Is that the one across from D&M Glass right on the corner?
Yeah.
Okay. That's very disrepair,
yeah. Yeah. So it needs help. And the glass one is in pretty good shape that Wagner's Woodworking used to be in, and he did a good job in updating that, but before he passed away. Yeah.
Being very new to Wilsonville, is there a good resource or two for knowing these points of interest? Like you showed the railroad depot, like I don't even know where.
Oh yeah, it's gone. It's long gone. Long gone.
Is there like a resource where we can know where those things were, just out of curiosity?
Oh.
Don't you have a little flyer that is about 25 or 30 of those little plaques in town?
There's a bunch of little plaques around. They need to be redone. That's part of what the Historical Society is on their list of to-dos, is to get those redone.
Is there a map of those that tells you where they are throughout town?
Yeah, there is a little map of those. Isn't there? Or there was a little map of those.
I thought the library had a bunch.
Library had some. But there's a lot of things like that we could do, as a community, could do a better job of preserving. And I don't know why the Historical Society, historical stuff has not caught on in Wilsonville the way it has in Sherwood or Tualatin, a couple of railroad towns. They don't have anywhere near the history that we do. And yet they have very robust historical societies and places and all those sort of things. So I don't know why. And they've preserved more of their buildings than we have. Yeah.
So why have they not put the right guy's face on the picture? You said that it's...
Well, that's a state thing. So it has to be done by the state of Oregon the next time they come around to upgrade their signs.
Oh, I see. I thought that was something the city had put together, and I thought, well, why did you...
Yeah. No one asked they didn't ask my opinion about that one. And I don't know. I haven't been over to there's also a state board over at the rest area, the French Prairie rest area, I think on the northbound.
Yeah.
On the northbound side, which you never stop at because you're almost home. And but that would be that's another one that needs to be reviewed. And to their credit, the Oregon Historic Marker Committee, which I was on for a short period of time, anytime they need to repair a sign, they start from the beginning and make sure that it's accurate, that what it's saying is true, that they haven't left out a part of the story that should be there, all those things. So they do a good job of review, but that one hasn't come up yet. So when it does, we'll let them know. Wrong picture. Yeah.
And McMinimans has a nice collection that they got from the Historical Society at the tavern, and there's a large number of Wilsonville history pictures there.
There's a lot at the library here. We have a lot of them.
But they don't have beer.
And there's no beer. See, just a second. My vision would be that the Historical Society needs to be located in the Toffman House overlooking Boone's Ferry. And then it could have rotating displays of, not like a museum, but of pictures on the wall and still be used as a meeting room, which is what they do in Sherwood and Tualatin. It still is a gathering place and you can have events there. But I think it would look better, it would be more interesting, people would want to go there, that sort of thing, if it was more lively with changing themes of historic pictures. Well, thank you for coming, and hope you can come back again on the 17th, and we'll have a good time. Much fun.